thank you for joining us today. This is our first speaker for this academic year in the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs Visiting Expert Series. And we have with us Dr. Kenneth Gofigan Kuper from the University of Guam. Dr. Kuper is Associate Professor of Political Science and Micronesian Studies at the Micronesian Area Research Center. And he runs their international relations agenda there as well. Okay, so today the talk is going to be Sharpening the Spear, Geostrategic Competition in Micronesia. So today's talk is actually it's co-sponsored by the Department of Asian Studies, the Center for Pacific Island Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Geography and Environment, as well as the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. So we're very grateful for those co-sponsoring with us. And thank you all for being here. When you run an event online and in person, you're always worried that it will be, yourself and the speaker. So I'm glad that we have an audience here as well as online. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kuper. Welcome.
Good day, everybody. Oh wow, there are people in here. I did not turn around at the time. Good day, everybody here and online. It's good to be back. I had so many Pacific Island Studies courses and Chamorro language courses right here at Moore Hall, so spent many formative hours. So thank you to all the sponsors and thank you all for being here. Today, I ask you to join me in exploring the intricate and evolving security landscape in Micronesia, a sub-region of Oceania at the crossroads of major global challenges and geopolitical rivalry. So I'm going to talk, they said 45 minutes. I timed it. Hopefully it goes well. But knowing me, sometimes I'm just going to make some random comment about Magic the Gathering or something, and it's just going to go off the rails. But I'll try my best. Okay. So, bam. No, I'm already failing. Oops. How do I change the slide? There we go. So, Thomas King poignantly writes, "The truth about stories is that's all we are. You have to be careful with the stories you tell, and you have to watch out for the stories that you are told." So in line with King, I first want to begin with what I consider an origin story for my deep interest in geopolitical competition. I was at a lavender farm in Maui. I tell this story quite often. But I was at a lavender farm in Maui when my mother called me crying. It was April of 2013. Between exasperated cries, my mom yelped and pleaded, "Son, please pray. They're going to bomb us." I frantically tried to reach her beneath her tears and asked, "Mom, what are you talking about?" She cried, "North Korea. They said they're going to bomb the island." She was referring to a threat made by the country declaring that their missiles could reach the military bases in the American territory of Guam. I was worried and felt powerless not being home, telling myself how unfair it would be if my island were to vanish while I was on spring break. This was quite a while ago, but this ultimately did not end up happening. Thankfully, but this incident reaffirmed my commitment to comprehensively understanding the role of islands in the world and the connection between security and insecurity in island communities. So from that point on, the guiding questions of my life became, number one, how can islands engage with the region and with the world differently? And number two, what then is the connection between security and insecurity? Today, I find these questions to be as important as ever amongst renewed geopolitical competition in Micronesia. Because at the heart of this competition, we're not only seeing military posturing and economic incentives, we're also seeing a tapestry of entangled and even contradictory stories being created and told. Stories about what is best for Micronesia, what will protect Micronesia, stories about threats to Micronesia, and differing vision for future chapters of Micronesia's story. My goal today is to not tell you the answer, but rather to give you the characters, the background, and the exposition of these different stories, as well as those trying to be the authors of these stories. We have not yet reached a conclusion to the Micronesia story, but actions taken today will shape future chapters. So to heed King's warning, it's up to you, the listening audience, to decipher which stories you will be careful in telling, and more importantly, whether these stories are yours to even tell or write. This brings us to the broader themes of this talk: the competition between the US and China for influence in Micronesia, the security risk posed to the region, and the impacts of these strategic decisions on the people of Micronesia. For our purposes here, I must mention that while Nauru and Kiribati are both geographically within Micronesia, my focus today is particularly on Guam, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. So with that being clear, let's begin with a brief geopolitical history of the United States and Micronesia. So after World War II, especially with the attack on Pearl Harbor, many in the United States believed that American security demanded American control over Micronesia. The United States was largely able to make this a reality. Historian Hal Friedman writes, "The Pacific represents the only region of the world where the United States deviated from its wartime political pledge not to obtain direct physical control over foreign territory." We can see this with the push for Micronesia under the trust territory of the Pacific Islands to be a quote-unquote strategic trust under the administration of the Security Council of the United Nations. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff said at the time, the Pacific and East Asia were inseparable for planning purposes. Control of Micronesia plays its role in the military's move to have mobile forces and island bases in the region, and even played a role in the contingency plan against the USSR. These chains of islands were to be controlled even if they were not to be developed into bases. Why? So that they can be denied to others. This would balance military security needs with potential domestic concerns on overspending for bases. This was achieved. All three of the freely associated states assigned the US responsibility for their security and defense, which includes strategic denial over land, airspace, and territorial seas, which means the right to deny third countries access to or use of the FAS territory for military purposes. A core component is also for the right for the US to establish military installations and facilities in the FAS. For the United States, this is the heart of the Compacts of Free Association. However, it is not just the Compacts of Free Association that enshrine this aspect of strategic denial. In order to fully understand the relationship, we cannot ignore the role of subsidiary agreements, such as the mutual security agreements and the military use and operating rights agreements, where the security relationship between the freely associated states and the US are more permanent than economic assistance packages due to mutual agreement language. Guam and the CNMI are right now US soil, thus we fall under the defense responsibilities of the United States. So a core component of US agreements with Micronesia is strategic denial. But what I'm going to argue today is that in today's geopolitical competition, strategic denial is shifting to strategic reclamation. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, resulting in the use of atomic weapons during war. This disastrously momentous occasion originated in the island of Tinian, part of the now Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. The Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field, and the Boxcar, which dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki 3 days after Hiroshima was bombed, also took off from Tinian. After World War II, the United States made an agreement with the Northern Marianas to lease close to 18,000 acres of Tinian to carry out US defense responsibilities. Now, due to strategic competition with China, the US is looking to use these airfields again and facilities that it once used during World War II. Brigadier General Michael Zussdorf commented, we're going to capitalize in investing in and bringing some of those bases to life. We're going to bring to life some mothballed bases that are out there, end quote. So what is happening in Tinian then represents a larger shift in US thinking about operations in the islands of Micronesia. Because of geostrategic competition, the US military is shifting to more distributed and dispersed operations, leading the United States to reclaim these mothballed facilities. Essentially, the US story from Micronesia is now adding a new chapter of strategic reclamation. Let's look at the origin of this story being written. The 2018 National Defense Strategy made it clear that the priority for the military was interstate strategic competition. To do this, the military needed to become strategically predictable, but operationally unpredictable. This new environment has led to the development of operating concepts within different service branches for more distributed and logistical operations. The core of all of these represents attempts to reduce the vulnerability of air, naval, and ground forces and increase their effectiveness against an adversary able to credibly disrupt, contest, or deny US control of the battle space. One relevant example to Micronesia is the Air Force's Agile Combat Employment, or ACE, defined as, quote, a proactive and reactive operational scheme of maneuver executed within threat timelines to increase survivability while generating combat power, end quote. During the Cold War, the Air Force had bases that were once sanctuaries, but new weapon systems and peer competitors are now placing these bases at risk, making them more vulnerable. Once US postures have been seen as purely a deterrent to adversaries, today US bases and posture in the region are arguably associated with more targeting risk. Advances in missile guidance and related technologies now offer US adversaries a means to attack US air bases without first defeating the Air Force in the air. So to counter this, ACE seeks to complicate the enemy's targeting process and create flexibility for the military and other friendly forces. Service members must be able to execute operations from various locations swiftly. This means spreading service members and military assets across a larger swath of locations so that they're not concentrated in one central location. Keep that in mind. So the more operating locations the military has to work from, the less damage that can be done to air operations with a single attack in one location. So this US emphasis on distribution and dispersal then is predicated on having both enduring locations, which support ongoing activities and interests on a permanent basis, as well as contingency locations, which provide temporary support for operations. So enduring locations we can call bases, and as they say, contingency locations are called places. So Lieutenant General John Thomas of the Air Force says, these places are what the bases are not. Alternate locations, sometimes remote, often austere, but with sufficient infrastructure to support maneuver and sustainment should use of operating locations become necessary. So again, the key reason is to permit dispersal of US and allied forces, reducing the concentration of assets in a main operating base to increase survivability and the ability to operate. This emphasis on securing quote unquote austere locations as contingency is a primary motivation in the US military's move to reclaim Micronesia and begin preparing the islands for potential use. It is this reorientation to disperse location that catalyzed this move from strategic denial to strategic reclamation. For the US, the islands of Micronesia can no longer just be places that are denied to others. They now are places that may have to be utilized. A recent report by the right-wing think tank Heritage Foundation notes, quote, Americans should primarily care about US engagements with the Pacific Islands because the US needs free and open access to transportation to the Western Pacific. Not least, it may one day need to surge forces, assets, and resources through the Pacific, the Micronesian subregion in particular, into conflict zones in Asia to defend US allies and interests abroad, end quote. Okay, so that's the thinking, at least those associated with Project 2025. So, as we can see, a part of finding more quote unquote places to operate from includes anxiety over access to US military bases in the case of kinetic conflict with a country like China. Would a long-standing ally like Japan allow the US military to sufficiently operate from its bases there in the case of a conflict with China? Some argue that allies would not seek to join the US in such a kinetic conflict, And this is a serious concern for the United States, and this is where Micronesia provides an advantage. Unlike host nations like Japan or South Korea, territories and freely associated states in Micronesia provide, quote unquote, stable access for the US via the compacts of free association or by essence of being a territory. A RAND report on ground-based intermediate range missiles assessed that, quote, it was very unlikely allies in the Indo-Pacific would be willing to host these new systems. One of them then is to place them in Guam or the freely associated states. If no US ally is willing to host, the sentiment is that the US can always rely on Micronesia. The argument is that the special political relationships the islands have with the United States reduces the obstacles of having the governments refusing to host the ground-based intermediate range missile systems. That's the thinking. More places to operate from in a new strategic environment in competition with China. So what is being done right now? Well, Guam's vulnerability as a factor has led to the military developing a divert airfield in the island of Tinian. A divert airfield is meant to support training and ensure that aircraft could meet mission requirements if access to other fields in the region was limited. In the case of Tinian, the divert airfield is primarily a contingency plan in the case of Guam. According to Department of Defense officials, the purpose is to establish these capabilities to ensure that we can meet mission requirements in the event access to Andersen Air Force Base Guam is limited or denied. Just sort of sink that in. If you live in Guam, there's something to be said there, right? In case access is limited or denied to Guam, we have Tinian to operate from. The Air Force has also been practicing ACE, such as Exercise Agile Reaper in March 2023, where F-22 Raptors operated out of Tinian's airport. Together, the Air Force hopes to turn Tinian into a large and functional ACE place. From the site of the atomic bomb runway to this new reclamation, Tinian is set to be used in the case of conflict in the region by the United States as a place they can go that is ready for them. In Palau, the US military is also ramping up activity and more regularly using Palau in exercises. As part of the Valiant Shield exercise in June 2022, the US Army Pacific's 1st Battalion fired the Patriot missile defense system to shoot down a dummy cruise missile in the Pacific. 2 Patriot interceptors launched from Palau and intercepted a missile target over 20 miles from the island. This was the first time the system was launched from Palau, and according to a spokesperson from Air and Missile Defense Command, was, quote, the first time a Patriot had combined with a stealth fighter for a live fire drill outside of testing in the US, end quote. A year later, in 2023, the Army conducted another Patriot missile live fire exercise from Palau. They've also reclaimed Peleliu Airfield, which was the site of a bloody World War II battle, and are set to host a tactical multi-mission over-the-radar system called TACMOR to enhance air domain awareness. So the US has argued that this radar system will be beneficial to both Palau and the US because it will promote a free and open Indo-Pacific. In the Federated States of Micronesia, similar trends of military infrastructure development are observed. Notably, the military plans to spend $400 million for these projects. The Air Force's $400 million package includes the extension of the airport's runway, the construction of a staging area for military use, the rehabilitation of the dock, and the repair of the road stretching from the airport to the seaport so that it can accommodate heavier vehicles. Besides the international airport, the US military wants to widen the channel through the reef and lagoon to provide access to Navy ships. While currently seeing less military activity than Palau, for example, this does not rule out the FSM's role in future US military operations. In a recent interview, former President and now FSM Senator Peter Christian said, "I doubt very much that China will go to the US and fight a war. I doubt that the US will go to China and start a war, but they might fight here." So this is something to track. So with all of these developments going on across Micronesia, let's get into more about what is causing this shift. And in order to understand this, we have to turn to my home, Guam. Guam. So Guam has served US strategic purposes for more than 100 years. Originally a coaling station for the Navy, after World War II, the island would become a major military asset for operations in the Western Pacific. Guam is an unincorporated territory, which has a role in power projection, logistics, deterrence, and assuring alliance credibility. Guam is host to major military installations, such as the newly opened, first time since like 1952, Marine Corps Camp Blas, Naval Base Guam, and Andersen Air Force Base Guam. As described by one of the deputy commanders at US Indo-PACOM, Guam is a place where our combat power will aggregate and congregate, and from which it will emanate. So a lot of eights there. From there, we send a powerful strategic message to our allies and our adversaries that the United States has invested in this region. Yet, it is precisely Guam's role as a strategic hub that makes it vulnerable. Some have observed that China has invested in a vast regional missile arsenal, increasingly capable of putting Guam at risk, and correspondingly rendering Guam a liability rather than an asset if it's not protected by advanced missile defense systems. Even members of Congress have commented on Guam's vulnerability, noting that despite its strategic importance, Guam remains highly vulnerable to a sophisticated network of missiles from the People's Republic of China. So we're now within range of certain PLA missiles, such as the intermediate range ballistic missile, which some have dubbed the Guam killer. I once got asked why there isn't a missile called the Nauru killer, and I think we all know the answer to that, and it lies to geopolitical importance, right? Someone's like, dude, there's no Nauru killer or like Kiribati killer. Why is there a Guam killer? And that was a very interesting thing to say. Let's just hope that there is never an FSM killer, Palau killer, or Marshall Islands killer that ever gets dubbed that way. Okay, that's the hope, that we don't reach that point. So, this has led the U.S. military to argue for 360-degree missile defense of the island, although there are significant feasibility issues on how to accomplish this, as well as local concerns about how this will affect Guam. So thus, in the case of conflict between the United States and China, Guam's role is to be a first line of defense, but also a first line of attack. We can see this through a recent CSIS report. In each of 24 wargame iterations, China attacks Andersen Air Force Base in Guam in the first phase of conflict. So what becomes clearer with each passing day is that if or when tensions between the United States and China turn kinetic, Guam and Taiwan are frighteningly entangled. And Guam's vulnerability then acts as this impetus for the US military to find places to operate from, especially if Andersen Air Force Base is no longer usable. So at the end of the day, distribution and dispersal in Micronesia is rooted in the pivotal question: what do we do if Guam is compromised? We can see this as the military emphasizes Guam's importance as a command and control node of operations across what is called the quote-unquote Guam cluster, which consists of Guam, the CNMI, Wake Island, Midway Island, and the freely associated states. At the same time that we're seeing this vulnerability, we're also seeing Guam become a suggested spot for US partners and allies. In the pipeline is the proposed bed down of 12 Republic of Singapore F-15 aircraft at Andersen Air Force Base by 2029. Japan's newly elected prime minister recently announced that he would like the Japanese Self-Defense Force to have a base in Guam, just like the US has bases in Japan. So against this backdrop, the US Senate Armed Services Committee just a couple of months ago in July, it's September, right? So a couple of months ago is accurate, requested that the US Secretary of Defense, quote, assesses the feasibility and advisability of using existing DoD facilities in Guam to host training detachments of the military forces of foreign partner countries on a rotational or permanent basis, end quote. For Guam, all these projects cannot be understood without understanding the conundrum of Guam's political status, as it highlights a central contradiction in what I believe is US foreign policy. While the US does champion democracy and self-determination in its Indo-Pacific strategy, it maintains control over territories like Guam, where the local population does not have full political rights and have not yet exercised the right to self-determination. A truly, quote unquote, free and open Indo-Pacific is difficult to achieve, in my estimation, as long as the US continues to maintain colonies like Guam. The lack of political power that Guam has is particularly striking given our central role in military strategy and planning. As discussed earlier, we're home to several major US military installations, and our residents serve in the US military at disproportionately high rates. Yet, despite the contributions to US national security, we're not granted either the full rights of US citizenship nor being substantively helped to achieve self-determination. Guam's unresolved colonial status, then, is a challenge to the US's broader strategic goals in the Indo-Pacific. If you want to promote democracy and the rule of law, I think the colonial status of Guam may undermine this credibility a bit. The issue of self-determination is not just about political rights. It's also about ensuring that the people of Guam have control over our own future. And I argue that Guam's future will affect Micronesia's security overall. All of these developments in Micronesia pose real questions for the security of the islands. First, the US military emphasis on distribution and dispersal does not simply refer to assets. Entangled with the dispersal of assets, though, is the dispersal of risk. The case of Guam outlined above shows the presence of the US military can come with targeting risk. For the rest of Micronesia, becoming spokes to operate from means being potentially dragged in to a conflict not of their own making. In a response to the radar project in Palau, 10 Palauan youth publicly commented, "The impacts of the military worry us, not just the environmental impacts, but also how militarization affects us today. As youth, we are the ones who will feel the consequences of these choices." So this raises important questions about the broader impact of militarization. Would the installation of such a system in Palau make it safer or a more attractive target in the event of conflict? This is something that Micronesians have to struggle with and decide. This dynamic between targeting and deterrence, spurred by the spread of risk, will be a key factor in the security horizon for Micronesia. The author of a report from the Congressional Research Service harkens back to the security dilemma to help us understand what's going on. He says the core of the security dilemma, well, is that effort for one state to increase its own security threatens other states, which in turn may actually decrease the security of the state rather than increase it. So even if each state says they are only doing things for defensive measures, there is not necessarily incentive for trusting the stated intentions of other countries. So this becomes a problem that may lead to an escalation spiral. The distribution of risk that is occurring in Micronesia forces one to consider what role this sub-region of Oceania will play in escalating tensions or potential kinetic conflict between the United States and China. The environmental impacts of militarization are also significant. Large-scale military installations often require extensive land, and often this land is taken from local communities. In Guam, nearly 27% of our land is currently occupied. This has led to tensions between the US military and local communities who feel that their land is being used without their consent, and that the environmental consequences of militarization are not being adequately addressed. In addition to the physical risks and environmental challenges, there are also broader social and political ones. The presence of foreign military bases can create a sense of dependency on external powers, and for some, militarization raises questions about the ability to make independent decisions about the future. Yet, some leaders in Micronesia disagree with the militarization framework or story. In a recent interview, Palau's president Suranga Wip said, quote, "One of the things that people say is we're militarizing the islands. The United States has made it very clear we're part of the homeland when it comes to security, and presence is deterrence." Whips would then go on to say, "I don't see it as militarization. I see it as presence, as deterrence, and as Reagan said, peace through strength," end quote. In this story, China is the largest threat. In this story, Micronesia needs to do its part to secure a free and open Indo-Pacific. In this story, the freely associated states are part of the homeland. The former president of the Federated States of Micronesia, David Panuelo, similarly asserted in 2021, saying it's such a comfort and a relief to hear that the FSM is part of the Pacific homeland that the United States is poised to defend. So in the homeland story, the FAS are part of the I will be defended family against countries like China. For Palau and the Marshall Islands, who recognize Taiwan as opposed to the People's Republic of China, US presence and assistance helps protect against a country that weaponizes tourism, blatantly squanders exclusive economic zones, and coerces them to switch recognition. The China threat story is also present in China's economic influence in the FSM, with government buildings and infrastructures being funded on a large scale. There is also the partnership story that pushes back against the militarization story. In this story, the United States, and particularly entities like the Coast Guard and civic action teams, are celebrated for their assistance in maritime security and humanitarian aid. And larger military proposals are celebrated for economic development opportunities. In the Northern Mariana Islands, the US military presence is often regarded as a significant economic driver. Local leaders have emphasized the positive economic impact of military projects, noting that although tourism in the region has declined, the presence of US service members has helped sustain local economies. The governor of the CNMI, Arnold Palacios, is actively turning away from Chinese tourism and looking instead to US military tourism. A member of his administration said, "For the governor and lieutenant governor, we're moving toward the direction of military tourism as we pivot away from our China market. We're trying to encourage Joint Region Marianas to conduct more military training exercises here," end quote. So it's part of an economic development story. In Palau, President Whips again said that military activity in Palau provides another source of economic activity. It builds up hotels, provides work, and more stability. In response to the building of the Tacmore radar, for example, US military representatives at a meeting told Palauan community that job opportunities for the construction of the radar site would benefit them, stressing that people who are hired to build the radar site also need food and other necessities, and they will patronize local stores. During the meeting, a flyer with information about job opportunities was passed out. Even after construction is completed, they said there will be contracts for various needs, such as maintaining facilities. A military officer revealed a large intention of emphasizing the economic aspect of these developments. Former head of Indo-PACOM, Aquilino, before the Senate earlier this year, testified, "In a crisis, bases and infrastructure in these territories and states, meaning the countries, will be crucial to sustain the joint force. US Indo-PACOM has worked diligently to build local support across the region. The national and territorial governments have welcomed the increased transparent communications and our willingness to incorporate local concerns into our plans," end quote. Furthermore, in that same heritage report I cited earlier, the author writes, "Competition with China is the single most important driver of US re-engagement in the Pacific Islands. And Pacific Islanders are very aware of this fact. This rationale is no secret, and a stronger strategy for us would in effect to be, say that quiet part out loud," end quote. So crucial to the narrative of the partnership story then is that US military presence and projects can help bring local development, while at the same time providing for mutually beneficial security. In this sense, encroaching Chinese influence in the FAS can help be alleviated. In this economic development and partnership story, though, one must wonder, however, how permanent the ink will dry. Author Matt Haig, in his recent novel, which you should all read, it's really good, writes, "You can always see the words from the pages before, their inky shadows darkening what is in front of you. This may apply to these stories being told today. Allow me to explain. In March 2024, the agreements renewing the economic provisions of the Compacts of Free Association were finally signed after months of congressional stalling. The US Beltway held the renewal as a boon to US posturing in the Pacific. With the economic provisions set to expire for FSM in the Marshall Islands in 2023 and Palau in 2024, the rush to get these provisions renewed was an anxiety-riddled process. The FSM's elected president, Wesley Simona, stressed the urgency at the time, saying, if nothing works out, if the US Congress does not approve it in time, we're faced with a fiscal cliff. As the process stalled, pressure was put on Congress by multiple parties. Progressives and China hawks agreed with funding the compacts, but perhaps for different reasons. Right-wing think tanks were staunch advocates for COFA, but their logic was purely geopolitical. Some of them would say the longer it takes the US to fund these national security agreements, the more likely the Chinese Communist Party will take advantage of this blunder. For these analysts, failing to fund the COFA states equated to losing ground in the Pacific. In a February 2024 letter regarding the compact, one of the presidents said, every day it's not approved plays into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. It's hard to blame the COFA leaders for using China rhetoric, as it seems that China is the only language that the United States speaks right now in relationship to the Pacific. However, the caution is ramping this rhetoric up as the core reason for economic renewal and more US funds. What could US policy be like when it comes to another economic renewal in 20 years? Let's say the China threat is very different. It's less urgent. We can engage in all of that later, but let's just say in 20 years, what if it's different? Would the US then decide not to renew the economic provisions, even if the security provisions of the COFA are perpetual? By tying the China threat rhetoric to the renewals this round, it further ties economic funding to geopolitics more tightly. This is a potential trap that may lead to requesting for more military presence and infrastructure in the islands in the name of economic development. Security for Micronesians then becomes forever entangled with the speaking the language of military strategy, making militarization, or in another story, military partnerships, the vehicle for economic development and the cure for human security issues may or may not be a sustainable long-term strategy, but it is one that needs to be pondered by Micronesia. So, this is the predicament that we are in as Micronesia today. As I often say, we are grass stuck in the middle of elephants fighting. And no matter which elephant you root for, you're likely to get stomped. The clash of these superpowers will have adverse effects on Micronesia's security, and none of them should be exempt from criticism. A story about US militarization does not excuse the behavior of China's recent ICBM testing in our blue continent. A story about Chinese coercion does not excuse the adverse effects of US militarization. Our position in the middle means we need to think about what is best for the grass, whatever that entails. But we cannot just simply believe that great powers will suddenly stop acting like great powers. We cannot just believe that what is best for a superpower security is always going to be the best for Micronesia's. We need to absorb it all and make some tough decisions. For us in Micronesia, we must not view what happens in Guam and Micronesia as a piece of a puzzle, exercise in strategic thought. For us in Micronesia, the stakes of the geopolitical gambit and environmental issues in our region are cut from a different cloth. For us, competition and conflict directly affects our lives, our homes, our families, our societies, our cultures, and our futures. Regional conflict between great powers is an existential threat to our way of life and our existence. Miscalculation may be a roadblock in the strategic minds of some, but for us in Micronesia, miscalculation could be a death sentence. So to conclude, while these are not all the stories out there, I believe these encapsulate much of the narrative circulating. Overall, the islands of Micronesia lie at the intersection of climate change and intensifying geopolitical heat. But there is no law or scientific phenomenon that says that the islands must forever float in this intersection. Micronesians did not put ourselves here. May the leaders and people of Micronesia come together to best figure out how to steer our futures in such a violent geography. The only thing for certain is that the best navigators follow their own star paths. The future of Micronesia is brightest when those who create the maps and write the stories of Micronesia are those who call the region home. May a Micronesian cartography birth a more peaceful geography. Micronesians must be the ones to hold the adze carving our futures. There's an old Tomoru proverb that goes, "Isaunya itamungo ta asedi kinu edu imismu masagwi," or greater is the fault on they who allow the injustice upon themselves. May the next Micronesian story be one written by Micronesian hands. Sijus Masi.
So thank you very much for that talk. We have already some questions from our online audience, but we also have our live audience here. So we can start here, and then I'll actually look through the questions as folks are talking here. So did anyone want to start, or shall I start with online? Any questions right away?
We have a word in tomorrow, it's called mamalo, which is like kind of shy, so munga mamalo. Just ask. We're all here, let's do it.
Okay, well, let me break the ice with an online question. So thank you very much for your excellent talk. The increasing US and ally basing on Guam looks like it will exacerbate the housing crisis and water issues. Do you see any pathways to ease that?
Well, that's hard. We're dealing with finite land, but we are trying through congressional routes to get it so that the U.S. military will build more on-base structures as opposed to like using housing off-base. So that's one route. There are some policy routes. We have the congressional candidates in Guam are talking about this and what to do. The organization that I formed, Pacific Center for Island Security, we're actually pushed out a 4-page housing narrative. So if anyone wants to look at that, you can email me and I will send it to you. Now, in regards to the other question was water issues. Mm-hmm. That one's very difficult. And the reason why it's very difficult is because Anderson Air Force Base sits over our only aquifer in Guam, right? And it's limestone, so it's porous. The southern part of Guam is geologically volcanic rock. So our water source is mainly in that part. And so we've had a history of contamination from trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene. There was a Coast Guard long-range navigation station, and as a result of that, down in the south, we had PCB contaminations. We still can't really fish in those waters, can't eat the fish in those waters. And so I think there are a lot of environmental impacts that were the result of dumping, like military dumping after World War II. This was before CERCLA, right? This was before the creation of Superfund sites and all of those things. So we're still dealing with that. We have our dump. The government of Guam actually won a lawsuit against one of the departments regarding ORDOT dump. And so we're trying. We understand it's a problem, but the newest one is the forever chemicals, yeah? PFOS, PFAS, those are hard things to counter because they're literally called forever chemicals, right? So yeah, we're trying the legislation route. They were putting at one point granular activated carbon filters to help cipher some of these things through, but I'm not I didn't graduate yet from the hydrology department. That's coming soon. So I'll be more scientific in talking about, I wish I could do that. I wish I was that smart, no. But for more scientific ways, we have our experts in Guam who are looking to this.
I have a question. So I'm from Tahiti, and like last week, China bombed French Polynesia with a fake training bomb, like just to train themselves and to know what they can do. And I was just wondering, like 2 weeks ago, Russia and China were actually doing like a military training in the Pacific. I was just wondering, like, what do you think about it? And like, should we be scared about it, or like, is it a problem? Like, I'm just scared because, like, I don't know. I'm here right now, and I don't know what's going on back home, and if there's anything happening, just like what you said earlier, you just touched my heart, and I was like, wow, I'm just thinking.
It's a loaded question, and I think what we should be afraid of is that a lot of countries are viewing the Pacific and have viewed the Pacific as a playground for a lot of these things, right? I mean, the French didn't stop testing and bombing until pretty darn recently, right? Like, I think some of us were alive when they stopped bombing. So, I mean, the whole point of that is like, not what I view the problem becoming is when we as Pacific Islanders are disproportionately putting like the evil on one without realizing that all parties involved in this game of great power competition and strategy are contributing to the potential decrease of our own security. Because for Pacific Islanders, security is not just traditional security concerns. We hear it all the time, right? It's climate change, it's sustainable economic development, right? It's clean water, it's food security. And so we have to think about all of these elements. For us in Micronesia, though, we don't have the luxury of saying something like the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General was like, we don't want geopolitics in our backyard. I want to be like, me neither, right? But in Micronesia, we don't have the luxury of not accepting that hard security questions are pivotal to our futures. And so should you be scared? I mean, not in the debilitating way that you can't function anymore in life, but concern. I mean, I'm concerned every single day. I'll tell you another story. I told this in Australia 3 weeks ago, but they were aircraft. My daughter was like 2 or 3, and there was an exercise, and the aircraft flew pretty close to the house, and my daughter got scared and jumped into my arms, and was saying, Tata, Ma, I'm scared. And I told her that I'll do anything I can to protect you. I'll always protect you. But in that same reassuring my daughter, there was also a sense of like powerlessness, because I don't know if I could actually protect her if Guam was bombed, right? I don't know if me hugging her will just be a comforting way to go rather than actually protecting her. And so I think that I believe in the power of agency of individuals. And I think that we all can have an impact on the decisions of tomorrow. So hopefully I can protect my daughter. That's the aspiration. That's why I do this work, because I don't want her to be put into a position like my grandmother was in. My grandmother is 89 years old. She lived through World War II. I still live with her today. She remembers getting grazed by bullets. She remembers losing her father during the war. We in the Pacific Islands know war. A repetition of that, something we should all avoid. Sorry, I'm trying to keep the line between a professional talk and telling my life story. It's not going that well, but.
I thank you for your talk. I'm from where are you from?
Ali.
I'm a PhD student in health, and one of the things I look at is militarism in Micronesia and its impact on health. We know World War II, but we know a lot of people outside of Micronesia don't know what Micronesians went through actually in World War II. Very traumatic. That's never been addressed throughout the whole region of Micronesia. Then, of course, right after that, the nuclear weapons testing in the Marshall Islands and what's that done to those people. And then the third thing that I see is more contemporary. It's the recruitment. Pacific is military recruitment paradise. Micronesia, American Samoa, whatnot. So my question is this initiative that you're talking about, is recruiting kind of a part of that? It's not talked about. The other thing that I want to know is how is it hard to get data out of the military? Micronesians in the military and rates of death and enrollment.
I've never tried. I've never tried to get that data, but what has been difficult was I tried FOIAing regarding pipelines. That was difficult, but recruitment to me is like, this is the thing about talking about these issues in Micronesia, right? It's like when your own people are serving in the military at high rates, quite often when you come out with a critique of the military projects, it's confused with a critique on the individual. And I think that's where we need to draw the line. This is not a critique of individual service members. I understand. I have friends who joined the military purely because they got someone pregnant in high school and it had no other way of thinking how they could support a child. That was their reality. I'm not going to disgrace that reality and say X, Y, or Z about it, right? a lot of our service members retired are suffering from underfunded veteran care, right? And so it is never an attack for me on the individual service members. It is a critique of a system that puts the incentives in place so that recruiting becomes a primary vehicle for escaping the economic reality of your homeland. And the conditioning of that structure so that that is the enticing aspect, right? When it's like, I get healthcare, I get education. If I don't do this, this will happen, right? And so, no, I think recruiting is a multifaceted issue, but you're right. It almost seems, there was a book that was released, Julian did it years ago, but one of the quotes that was there was this CNMI recruiter who was saying, man, you guys are struggling to meet recruitment rates? Oh, I'm living the nice life over here in Saipan, right? And so those, and then you get like $10,000 bonuses when you sign up, right? So all of those, sometimes it's hard for local governments to compete. And so I'm against criticizing the individual service member. I'm in favor of critiquing the system of those incentives.
Thank you, Ken, for the presentation. I just want to expand the discussion a bit more and focus not only on the US and China, although really important players, but bring in other players as well in the region, Australia in particular, and especially, the US relationship with Australia under various arrangements, including B-52 bombers in Darwin, the use of Pine Gap, the rotational force in Australia. So there's this network of relationships. And then, of course, the Philippines. So if we look at Southeast Asia, and they attempt to negotiate their relationship with the US and with China, because China is equally important. And so you have this network of relationships that actually make our part of the world, meaning the Pacific and Southeast Asia, become entangled in this geopolitical competition that could potentially be dangerous for us. I wonder if you could go beyond Micronesia and speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, with the enhanced defense cooperation agreements in the Philippines, the increasing sort of South China Sea, militarization of the South China Sea, that's something that will affect a lot of folks. But I think that this is a conversation we were having at lunch. One of the key things here is that islands are used beyond just the island, the Micronesian islands. Islands in general are used in this way. If you speak about Australia, right, they have a territory called the Cocos and Keeling Islands, and they're trying to develop the Cocos Islands to accommodate heavier aircraft, right? If you look at Japan, there are islands in the prefecture of Okinawa, not just Okinawa, we're talking about places like Yonaguni Island, right? So the Japan Self-Defense Forces are using these islands because they're strategically located near Taiwan, right? And they're also one of the easternmost islands. Japan is taking something for missile training, right? And so all of these countries are using their non-contiguous islands as a way to sort of exercise new strategic thought and military exercise and testing. And so I think that's the larger part is if you were to turn to the Philippines, you can be sure that you'll be looking at the role that some islands will have. If you look at Japan, right? South Korea, there's Jeju, right? So what is it geographically about the island? That's something that I'm, the guiding question of my life, right? Was how do islands relate to the world? And I think we have been primed for people to believe that we are places that can be exploited because we provide less political headache, right? Doing something in mainland Japan is different from doing something in an island like Yonaguni Island, right? Or Okinawa. So right now with minilateralism that's going on, I think there's like a tightening minilateralism with our neighbors in East Asia and Southeast Asia that is essentially drawing a line down the middle and it's like, where do you fall, right? And so what I'm deathly afraid of is that we in the Pacific take very hardened positions about siding with one side only, because then I think what happens is that number one, you lose leverage. I'm not a fan of long-term leveraging, but I think there are short-term benefits. I think long-term leveraging can be quite disastrous. But in the second is like, we all know with tightening alliances, what happens when conflict comes in is that you get drawn in. So what goes on in Micronesia is largely not an effect of just the United States and China, you're right? But it's also what happens in Australia, right? What happens in South Korea, right? What happens in Japan, what happens in the Philippines. And all of these places are like 3 hours from Guam, which is part of why we're so strategically located, right? So yeah, the conversation goes way beyond the United States and China, but they are two of the main drivers in my estimation.
Great, thank you. There were a number of questions about other islands coming from our online audience. So that was a great way to, I think, address a lot of those questions. And if our audience online has further questions in that vein, please do type in, because I'm keeping track here. I think, we're getting close to the end of our time, and I would like to ask, on behalf of the online audience, and perhaps there are folks here too who are thinking about this, there are many questions that basically get at what are the alternatives to militarization? What kind of agency can Micronesia exercise to, perhaps have an alternative future?
Well, I think it would require a lot of sacrifice. Because, as I mentioned in the talk, a lot of the reason why military development projects are attractive is because of the economic development potential. But I think a lot of this is about, there are some that argue that the United States did not do its diligence when it came to actually developing the islands during the trust territory period. And so there's a genealogy of the islands not, quote unquote, being developed that lies in just like, not even like nefarious or malicious intention, just the tyranny of neglect and distance, right? So this sort of like just out there. And so there's that history that I think affected the economic trajectory of many of these places. So we can't just, and I've heard this from people who are just like, oh, the islands will never do that because they're all mismanaging funds. That's an argument that people have told me, right? But then you have to counter and be like, well, how was the economic system set up? And why is it that when you have management mechanisms that were enshrined in Compact 2 for the Marshall Islands and the FSM, the composition of that board, GEMCO and GEMFAC, is 3 US representatives and 2 FSM or Marshall Island representatives. There's an inequity in the way that's the composition of that. But so number one, I think we have to acknowledge and study the historical trajectory of economic development so that we don't become myopic on what the alternatives are. That's the first thing, right? Because if we don't study that trajectory and what could have been, all we're really saying is that military economic development is the only path forward. Now, is there a dependency on United States federal funding for the compacts? And the answer a lot of times is yes. Just like in Guam, the huge pillar of our economy is federal spending, right? Related to military construction projects. And if you talk about economic alternatives, it becomes, what about the federal benefits that I get? What about my food stamps? These federal programs, and these are important questions. They're not questions to simply say, oh, you're colonizing your mind. No, people actually care deeply about these things. So that would be the first. I think there needs to be a public education campaign more so that young Micronesian youth understand how our economy is developed this way so that it prevents myopia in thought. Number two, I think we have to really engage more and more with sub-regionalism and regionalism, even with Asia, right? I think that's another way to increase idea sharing, technical cooperation. But the answer is going to be quite difficult in escaping the US military orbit entirely because of the way that the Compacts of Free Association are set up. As I wasn't very clear in the talk, but I'll do it now. Even if the compacts are terminated entirely, the US still gets security rights because on those subsidiary agreements I referenced earlier, the language is actually mutual agreement. You can terminate the compact unilaterally, all of these compacts can be terminated unilaterally. But the subsidiary agreements that went into effect almost at the same time or a little bit after, that language is explicitly mutual. So escaping the US military orbit, if that is something that that Micronesians want to occur, it will be very difficult, it would be very legal, but I think there's a way to balance, there needs to be a balance, right? So for me, the question on Micronesian policymakers' minds is that I look at some of the rhetoric sometimes and it's like, you're obviously leaning on this one cash cow, right? But the problem is, like, we have Lati in Guam. The problem is that if you rely on too few pillars, the foundation is incredibly weak, right? And so another thing to be said is that we in Guam have had industries that have been entirely killed in the federal government, like Head Note 3A. We were developing watches and it was doing pretty well, but US domestic watchmakers thought it was too much of a threat. And so they changed the quotas in Congress, they just changed it. And that no longer became an alternative economic development vehicle for us. And so a lot of Chinese influence in Micronesia, like, if you want to complain about that as the United States, you have to step up. And it cannot just be all military, right? You have to listen to the security and development needs of Pacific Islanders and implement that. Because implementation, I think, has been the most difficult part of US policy toward the Pacific. And so economic development will be a multifaceted approach that has to take into the perspectives of the historical trajectory, but also, honestly, if the US wants to engage, it has to do its part to understand development needs beyond sort of micromanagement of compact sector assistance grants.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time here. Please do join us upstairs for